My name is Diana Calloway. I am 29 years old, and I have been married to my husband for 3 years. Last Thanksgiving, at a dinner table surrounded by his entire family, my brother-in-law stood up and accused me of stealing his grandmother's diamond ring. He had photographs. He had a timeline. He had the whole room convinced within 60 seconds. Everyone looked at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into their home and helped herself to whatever she wanted. My mother-in-law had tears in her eyes. My husband had gone completely still beside me. But I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself the way everyone expected me to. Because 2 weeks before that dinner, I had already found something that made everything my brother-in-law was about to say completely irrelevant. And I had been waiting, very patiently, for exactly the right moment to use it. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story didn't start at Thanksgiving. It started long before that. On the very first afternoon, my husband brought me home to meet his family. My husband's family lives in a large house outside of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of house that has a long driveway and a wraparound porch and photographs going back 4 generations hanging in the hallway. His mother is warm and soft-spoken. His father passed away several years ago. And then there is his older brother. From the moment we shook hands that first Sunday, I could feel it. The slight pause before he smiled. The way his eyes moved over me like he was calculating something. He asked me what I did for work, and when I told him I was a physical therapist, he nodded slowly and said, "Interesting," in a tone that made it sound like the opposite of interesting. My husband laughed it off on the drive home and said his brother was like that with everyone, just guarded. He told me, "He'll warm up." He never warmed up. Over the next 3 years, my brother-in-law found small and quiet ways to remind me that I was not fully trusted. He would reference family decisions made before I came along, as if I needed to understand that certain things were already settled and I had no say in them. He would make comments about how much money things cost whenever I was around. Once, at a birthday dinner for my mother-in-law, he casually mentioned to a relative that it must be nice to marry into a comfortable life. He said it while looking at me. I smiled and said nothing. I had learned early on that with him, silence was my best tool. The ring in question had belonged to my husband's grandmother. It was a round-cut diamond set in platinum, and it had been passed down with the understanding that it would eventually be given to whichever grandchild got married first. My husband was the first to marry, which meant the ring was meant to come to me. My mother-in-law had told me this herself, quietly, over coffee one afternoon when we were alone. She said she had been setting it aside for us, and that she wanted to give it to me properly, at Christmas. She said she hadn't told anyone else yet, because she didn't want it to become a whole thing. I thanked her and told her she didn't have to do that, and she squeezed my hand and said she wanted to. I never told my husband about that conversation. I thought it would be a nice surprise for him too. What I didn't know was that someone else in the family already had plans for that ring. Thanksgiving came on a cold Thursday in November. My mother-in-law had been cooking since Tuesday. The house smelled like butter and rosemary, and the kind of warmth that only exists in houses where someone truly loves feeding people. There were 14 of us around the table that year. My husband and I sat near the middle. My brother-in-law sat at the far end with his wife and their 2 kids. The meal was beautiful. Everyone was laughing and passing dishes and refilling glasses, and for the first hour, everything felt normal and good. Then my mother-in-law quietly excused herself from the table. She came back a few minutes later and stood in the doorway to the dining room with a look on her face that I had never seen before. Her hands were folded together in front of her, and her eyes were moving slowly around the table. She said she needed to ask everyone something. The conversation softened and then stopped. She said she had gone upstairs to get something from her jewelry box, and it wasn't there. She had been looking for 20 minutes. She said she kept grandmother's ring in a velvet pouch in the top drawer, and the pouch was there, but the ring was gone. The table went quiet. My mother-in-law looked distressed. A few people started asking questions. When did she last see it? Was she sure she was looking in the right place? Could it have been moved? I watched my mother-in-law shake her head at every suggestion, and I felt a familiar tightening in my stomach. Not because I was guilty, because I had seen that look on my brother-in-law's face the moment she started speaking. It was the same look from that first Sunday afternoon, 3 years ago. Calculating. Patient, like he had been expecting this. He waited exactly long enough to let the confusion settle, and then he spoke. He said he didn't want to make things worse, but that he thought everyone should know that he had seen me go upstairs earlier in the evening. He said he hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but given the circumstances, he felt like it was important to mention. Every head at the table slowly turned toward me. My husband looked at me and asked quietly if I had gone upstairs. I said yes, I had used the bathroom. He nodded, but I could see him calculating too, the way people do when they're trying very hard not to believe something and failing. My brother-in-law's wife cleared her throat and said she thought maybe someone should check my bag. She said it softly, like she was embarrassed to suggest it, but she suggested it anyway. My brother-in-law gave her the smallest nod. I looked at my husband. He looked at me. I could see him working through it, and I could see how much he did not want to be in that moment. Here is what I want you to understand. I was not afraid of anyone checking my bag. I was not afraid because I already knew exactly where that ring was, and it was not anywhere near me. But it wasn't the bag search that I was thinking about in that moment. I was thinking about the fact that 2 weeks earlier, I had found something that my brother-in-law had absolutely no idea I had found. Let me tell you how that happened. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I had come to my mother-in-law's house on a Tuesday afternoon to help her clean out the spare room. My husband was at work, and she had asked if I could come by and help her move some boxes. We spent the afternoon going through old things, and at some point she left me alone in the room while she went to make tea. I wasn't snooping. I was just stacking boxes near the window when I accidentally knocked a small cardboard box off the shelf. Papers slid out onto the floor. I bent down to gather them and noticed that several of them were financial documents. I wasn't trying to read them, but when you're holding something in your hands, you see it. One sheet was a printout of a wire transfer. The amount was significant. The account it came from was a trust account. I recognized because my husband had mentioned it once. It was a small investment trust that his grandmother had set up before she died, intended to be divided among her grandchildren when the estate was fully settled. The name listed as the initiating party on the transfer was my brother-in-law. I put the papers back in the box and set it on the shelf. I didn't say anything to my mother-in-law. I went home that evening and sat with what I had seen for a long time. I told myself there could be a reasonable explanation. Maybe he was managing something on behalf of the family. Maybe it was authorized, but something about it stayed with me, quiet and sharp, the way things do when they don't quite add up. So I made a copy. 3 days later, I went back to the house under the pretense of dropping off a casserole. My mother-in-law invited me in for coffee, and at some point I asked if I could use her printer. She said, of course. I accessed the document I had photographed, printed a clean copy, and folded it into my coat pocket. Then I called a friend of mine from college, who works in financial compliance, and I asked her, casually, what a transfer like this would look like if it were not authorized. She asked me some questions. She asked me to send her the document. She called me back the next morning, and she was not casual anymore. That was the information I had been sitting on for 2 weeks. That was why. When my brother-in-law pointed his finger at me across the Thanksgiving table, I was not afraid. I looked around the table and said that I didn't have any problem with anyone checking my bag. I picked up my purse from the back of my chair and set it in the center of the table. My mother-in-law looked pained. My husband looked relieved that I wasn't upset. My brother-in-law looked exactly like someone who expected to be proven right. My sister-in-law reached over and opened my bag. She looked inside. She moved things around carefully. She set it down and said quietly that she didn't see anything. Someone at the table exhaled. My mother-in-law pressed her hand to her mouth. My brother-in-law's expression barely changed. He said that was a relief, but that the ring was still missing, and that he thought everyone should be honest about who had been where in the house that evening. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said I agreed. He blinked. I said, since we're being thorough, I thought it was worth mentioning that my mother-in-law's house has a security camera system. My husband had installed it for her the previous spring after there had been a break-in 2 streets over. There were cameras at the front door, the back door, and one covering the staircase and the upstairs hallway. The table was silent. My brother-in-law said he knew about the cameras. I said I thought he might. Then I looked at my mother-in-law and asked if we could pull up the footage. My mother-in-law looked confused. She asked what I was suggesting. I told her I wasn't suggesting anything. I just thought that if the goal was to find out what happened to the ring, the cameras would show us exactly who went upstairs and when. My husband was already standing up. He said he knew how to access the system from his phone because he was the one who had set it up. He pulled out his phone and connected it to the large television in the living room, the one visible from the dining room table. A few family members got up and moved closer. The footage from the camera covering the upstairs hallway was time-stamped and clear. We watched the footage together. I had gone upstairs at 6:43. I was on the second floor for less than 4 minutes. The bathroom was clearly visible at the end of the hallway, and that is where I went. I came back downstairs at 6:47. There was a silence as people registered that. Then the footage showed something else. My brother-in-law had gone upstairs at 6:17, 26 minutes before I did. He was on the second floor for 11 minutes. He walked past the bathroom and turned toward the end of the hallway where my mother-in-law's bedroom was. He went inside. He came back out. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then, he went downstairs. The room had gone very, very quiet. My mother-in-law was staring at the television. Her son was on the screen, walking into her bedroom 11 minutes before the ring was reported missing. My brother-in-law said the footage didn't prove anything. He said he had just checked in on her room because she had mentioned a window was sticking and he was going to look at it. His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. His wife was looking at him differently now. The two kids were staring at their plates. My husband turned off the footage and looked at his brother. He asked, very quietly, why he hadn't mentioned going upstairs when he brought up seeing me go up. My brother-in-law said he hadn't thought it was relevant. The table was watching him now the way it had been watching me 20 minutes ago. I let the silence hold for a moment. Then I said I thought there was something else the family deserved to know. My brother-in-law looked at me. His expression had changed. There was something beneath the steadiness now, something brittle. I said I wanted to be careful and respectful because this was a family I loved and this was a hard evening already. I said I had not planned to bring this up tonight. I had been hoping to handle it privately. But given what had just happened, I felt like I didn't have a choice anymore. My husband asked me what I was talking about. I said I was talking about the family trust account. My brother-in-law's entire posture changed. It was subtle, barely visible, but I had been watching him for 3 years, and I knew every microexpression he had. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. His eyes went slightly flat. My mother-in-law looked up at me with a question on her face. I explained, slowly and carefully, that 2 weeks ago I had accidentally come across a financial document while helping in the spare room. I said I hadn't said anything because I wanted to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, and I wanted to have the information verified before I brought it forward. I said I had since had it reviewed by a professional and that I had a copy with me because I had brought it tonight just in case, though I had genuinely hoped I wouldn't need it. My brother-in-law's voice came sharp and fast. He said I was deflecting. He said I was trying to make this about something else because I had been caught. My mother-in-law looked at him, and then at me, and asked what document I had found. I reached into my coat, which was hanging on the back of my chair, and I took out the folded printout. I unfolded it and set it on the table in front of my mother-in-law. She looked at it for a long time. Her face was very still. It was the wire transfer. $64,000 moved out of the grandchildren's trust account, initiated by my brother-in-law. The destination was a private account that the compliance specialist I had contacted confirmed was not part of any documented estate transaction. My mother-in-law looked up at her older son. She said his name very quietly. He shook his head and said it wasn't what it looked like. He said he had been managing the account and the transfer was a temporary move for tax purposes, and he had been planning to explain it to everyone after the holidays. My husband asked if their mother knew about it. The silence was the answer. My husband looked at the document. He looked at his brother. He asked how long this had been going on. My brother-in-law said there was nothing going on. He raised his voice slightly. He said I had clearly been going through private family documents and that everyone should be asking why his brother's wife was digging through financial records that had nothing to do with her. One of the uncles at the far end of the table said, quietly, that it seemed like she was the one who found it, not looked for it. My brother-in-law turned toward the uncle and started to say something, and then stopped. He looked around the table. He looked at his wife, who was sitting very still and not meeting his eyes. He looked at his mother, who was still holding the paper. He looked at my husband. He did not look at me. Then he said something I will never forget. He said, "You have no idea what this family was like before you got here." He was looking at me. I waited a moment before I answered. Then I said that was probably true. I said I hadn't been here for the beginning, and I wasn't the one making decisions before I arrived. But I said I had been here for 3 years, and in those 3 years I had tried very hard to be respectful and patient and to belong to this family. I said I had never once done anything to harm anyone at that table. I said I had sat quietly through years of small comments and pointed looks and the constant low-grade message that I didn't quite fit. And I said that tonight, when he pointed at me in front of everyone. I had 2 choices. I could have gotten up and left. Or I could tell the truth. I said I chose to tell the truth because I thought this family deserved it, even if he had decided they didn't. No one spoke for a very long time. My mother-in-law set the document down on the table. She pressed her hands flat against the surface. She looked at her older son and said she wanted to know where the ring was. He didn't answer right away. She said his name again. This time, it was not a question. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. He set a small velvet pouch on the table. My mother-in-law looked at it for a moment, then picked it up and held it without opening it. The table was utterly silent. My husband stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward his brother. He just stood there and said, "You need to go." My brother-in-law looked around the room one final time. His wife had her hand over her eyes. The kids were staring down. The aunts and uncles and cousins were all looking somewhere else, the careful way people look away when they have just witnessed something they cannot undo. He pushed his chair back. He stood up. He said, very quietly, that this wasn't over. My husband said that yes, it was. My brother-in-law walked through the dining room and down the hallway and out the front door. A few seconds later, we heard a car start in the driveway and then pull away. The house was very still. My mother-in-law was the first one to move. She stood up from the table and walked around to where I was sitting, and she put her arms around me from behind and held on. She said she was so sorry. She said it more than once. Into my hair, and I could feel her shaking slightly. I put my hands over hers and told her she didn't need to apologize. She said yes, she did. She said she should have seen it sooner. My husband sat back down beside me and took my hand under the table. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said my name, just my name, and I understood everything in it. Later, after the other family members had slowly and awkwardly started clearing plates, and the children had been sent to watch something in the other room, my husband and I sat together at the kitchen counter while his mother made tea. He asked me why I hadn't told him about the document sooner. I said I hadn't wanted to put him in the middle of something I wasn't completely sure about yet. I said I had needed to know before I said anything out loud, because once you say something like that about someone's brother, you can't unsay it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded and said he understood. He also said he was sorry he had gone still at the table when his brother first pointed at me. He said he was ashamed of that. I told him I knew exactly what it felt like to have someone you love stand in front of you with what looks like certainty, and I told him that I didn't blame him for the 2 seconds it took him to catch up. He squeezed my hand very tight. My mother-in-law placed a mug in front of each of us and sat down across the counter. She opened the velvet pouch and tipped the ring out into her palm. It was beautiful, small and bright and absolutely real. She held it out to me and said that she wanted me to have it, tonight, right now, not at Christmas the way she had originally planned. She said she was done waiting for the right moment. I looked at my husband and he gave me a small nod, and I held out my hand and she slid it onto my finger. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I know the question on most people's minds is whether my brother-in-law was ever held accountable. The answer is yes, but it took time. In the weeks after Thanksgiving, my mother-in-law worked with a family attorney to have the trust account fully audited. The review confirmed that the transfer I had found was not the only one. Over 18 months, a total of just over $100,000 had been moved out of the trust in increments small enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. An independent forensic accountant documented everything. My brother-in-law eventually agreed to a repayment arrangement as part of a private settlement to avoid a full legal proceeding. though the attorney made clear that if he missed a single payment, the matter would be referred to the district attorney's office. He has not missed a payment. His relationship with the family remains broken in ways that a wire transfer schedule cannot fix. I have thought a lot about why my brother-in-law did what he did that night at Thanksgiving, not the theft. I understand the theft in a cold and practical way. He had been moving money, and he knew that eventually someone would notice. And when my mother-in-law announced the ring was missing, he saw a chance to create chaos and suspicion that might redirect attention away from him. What I think about more is the calculation behind it. The way he looked at me that very first Sunday and decided, before he even knew me, that I was the right person to use when he needed a distraction. The way 3 years of small comments and quiet undermining had been, in some part, an investment. Keep her on the outside just enough so that when you need people to doubt her, the doubt comes easily. What he didn't account for was that I had spent 3 years paying attention to. My husband and I still go to his mother's house for holidays. The table is smaller now, and quieter in some ways, but there is something easier about it. My mother-in-law and I have a relationship that belongs entirely to the two of us now, without the interference of a third presence that was never comfortable with it. She still makes too much food. I still come early to help her in the kitchen. She tells me stories about my husband when he was young, and I listen to every single one. The ring fits perfectly. By the way, I don't know if she had it sized or if it was just luck. I never asked. Some things you let be exactly what they are.